No role plays, just real. Chris and Lorenzo share 4 decades of combined experience to help you become a more effective leader.
We've never really, as a workforce, spent a lot of time on making sure we're developing good leaders.
We'll be able to share stories, experience, mistakes, failures, successes.
This is Hacking Your Leadership.
Welcome to Hacking Your Leadership. I'm Chris.
And I'm Lorenzo.
And Lorenzo, on this episode, I want to talk about accountability.
Yes, I like this. I'm all in. Let's talk about it.
It's a word that, you already know. If you're listening right now, you hear that word and you're thinking, if you're a leader, I don't like being held accountable, or B, it's tough to hold my people accountable, or at least not tough, but uncomfortable. It could be uncomfortable. There's an inherent negative connotation to it. And a lot of leaders have a really difficult time doing it. There are differences across the board in terms of what people think accountability is. I was reading an article by Ron Carucci, who's a friend of the show, and I really like the work that he does. And in an article he wrote a few weeks ago, he says that 82% of managers say they have limited to no ability to hold others accountable successfully. And I can interpret that two ways. One, either they believe they're being handcuffed by their organization or by their leaders in terms of what they are and are not allowed to use as accountability tools, or they actually don't know how to hold people accountable. And it's definitely a mix of both. Like, there's some leaders don't know how to do this correctly. Some leaders do know how to do it correctly, but they lack the ability to navigate their organization the right way in order to hold people accountable. But it's a tough water to be in right now, especially if you're in an organization where there are a lot of people leaving, or you're worried about them leaving, and you worry that any type of accountability is going to lead to them thinking, "Oh, I'm done here. I'm just going to go find another job anyway." One where they don't hold me accountable, right? And so it's an interesting topic to have, and I think it's an important topic to have because I think a lot of leaders are kind of feeling this right now.
Yeah, it's one of those topics that I think is always relevant to have dialogue about. It's always relevant to talk through and figure out. And I think coming out of what we've talked about, over the last couple of years with just the idea of the workforce and people looking for work and jobs, and people, organizations being understaffed and things like that. Like, I can imagine in industries like the restaurant industry, or places, even small mom and pop type retailers where you've walked by and seen the signs like, we're closed because of lack of staffing, or we've limited hours because of a lack of staffing. Like, just thinking about how do you even bring about accountability in some of those spaces when the end result would be even less staffing. And so right. I think that there is a lot to kind of unpack and to talk about here. I agree with you. Even to this day, when most people hear that term, it has a very negative connotation to it for different reasons. From an employee standpoint, it doesn't necessarily feel good to be held accountable, especially if there's not consistency. I think it's one thing where a lot of times, and I think Ron talks about this in the article, where people call for accountability. Teams and employees want there to be accountability. And I think underneath that, what they're saying is that I want to make sure that if I put forth a full effort, that everybody is expected to put forth that full effort. And that if I'm picking up the slack because somebody else is not doing the work, that there's accountability there. And then you have leaders that hear it and immediately think of like, well, yeah, like, can I... if I want to fast forward accountability because I think this person should be held accountable, or they should be let go from a company for one reason or another, and it's not happening fast enough, then all of a sudden, like, I'm not able to hold people accountable. Like, there's just a lot of kind of noise in the system on all different areas right now. So I think it's good for us to talk about this and kind of like, where are we today? What are we seeing? What's the data say? But also, what does it really mean? To ourselves, what does it mean to hold someone accountable, and what are you looking to achieve with the accountability? Because I think accountability can be extremely helpful and powerful and empowering when you are teaching and helping to inspire people to be self-accountable. But it's not a matter of holding somebody to a policy. It's a matter of helping people to raise the bar of their own expectations, and then helping to teach people how to manage those expectations or exceed those expectations.
Yeah, I think there are two things that I think have to be acknowledged when it comes to holding somebody accountable. And the first is that one, there needs to be a mix of the objective and the subjective. And here's what I mean by that. If you are holding somebody accountable without any criteria or data that is viewable on an Excel spreadsheet or written down over time and accumulated that meets a standard set by either your organization or you, if you are the boss in the organization, that is not held consistently across every single person that has these same expectations, then you open yourself up to problems in terms of favoritism or wrongful termination lawsuits. And there are a lot of reasons to have a paper trail of accountability when it comes to the decision to hold somebody accountable if it leads to a loss of income or a loss of employment. So that has to be stated up front. But it's really difficult to affect the change needed. Because when you talk about holding somebody accountable, the idea is that they change, that they make the changes necessary to where it becomes a conversation that is a kind of a coaching where they change what they're doing that's incorrect, and then you don't need to go further down that path. It's a blip on the radar as opposed to the first step in a long line of things that leads to them going away. So if you approach it from that standpoint, you want to have the relationship with them to where they trust you enough to want to make those changes. And if your relationship with them is based solely in the transactional or the objective criteria of holding them accountable, you won't have that trust with them. You won't have that relationship with them. And so you have to be able to separate the two. And so what that looks like to me is if you're holding somebody accountable for something in that they've done something wrong and it has to be they have to be talked to about it, whether it's written down, they have to sign something or not, but it's something that has to be kind of put into the system that says, hey, we had this conversation. There needs to be a very, very clear message from you as the leader that this does not impact the relationship from your standpoint. Meaning you cannot treat them differently going forward. You can't hold a grudge. They can't perceive you as holding a grudge. Like, oh, I had a lot of faith in that person and they messed up, so I've written them off. Great, go ahead and do that. And then they will perform accordingly for a boss who has written them off. But if you hold them accountable to something from a very transactional standpoint, you are not rolling your eyes at them. You don't react emotionally to it. You present it as something that is required because everybody is required to meet the standard. But hey, you know what? You're confident that they're going to be able to make this change going forward, and you're here to help them and support them in whatever they need to make sure that they don't have to have more of these conversations going forward. And your actions and your efforts back that up going forward. Then you can absolutely separate the two, and you can have those conversations with somebody that need to happen and still have the relationship with them. But the relationship has to already be there to begin with. So that's the first thing. The second thing is, we've talked about this on the show before, the idea of head, heart, and hands, right? If a person is not doing what they need to do, one of three things is missing: the head, the heart, or the hands. If the hands means the tools they need to do the job, so are they missing tools? And if so, that's your job as the leader to find out what's missing, find out why it's missing, and help provide that. If they're missing the head, that means they have the knowledge or the training necessary, and maybe that's self-led, maybe that's you as a leader's responsibility. That could be kind of a mixed bag of it's their responsibility and your responsibility as a leader. And then there's the heart, and the heart is 100% on the responsibility of the employee themselves. And holding somebody accountable who's missing the head or the hands looks very different than holding somebody accountable who's missing the heart. And if you go into a relationship with a person holding them accountable the exact same way without knowing what is missing, the head, the heart, or the hands, it's not going to work correctly, because a person missing the heart needs different accountability than a person missing the head or the hands. And so I think these are the kind of things that have to be worked out with you as a leader in your own head in preparation to make sure these accountability conversations work correctly, and that they're not just they're not just the first step in a line that inevitably leads to the destruction of the relationship and the job.
Yeah, I want to underline something that you said and kind of spend a little bit more time there. I think that there's levels, there's kind of a spectrum of accountability in my mind as far as like getting to the point of documenting somebody's, lack of behaviors or whatever the case is. There's
something
one
formal.
side. Yeah, exactly. Like formalizing something, right? One side of it is like there are policies and procedures that are, things that have to do with safety and stuff like that, where like there's accountability because what you did either created a potential safety concern or a loss of money like there's things like that. And we're not talking about those things in my mind. Like those things, they are what they are. and you have to have a conversation, and anybody can be held accountable at any level for doing those types of things. I think what we're talking about in this context is like the behavioral element of what you said, which is like changing behavior. And I think done the right way, there's two ways in my mind that really happens. The first way is that you're upfront about it. You're very, very clear upfront about here's what the expectations of the job are. Here are the things that we do every day. Here are the things that we define, and here's how we hold people accountable. You know, if you are lacking of this, then this is what this would look like. There'd be a conversation. There would be this. There would be that. If you're having trouble with this, this is what it would look like. Like, you are very upfront about what accountability is and how it works in your organization and how these things happen. And I think if you start there with people understanding, answer any questions, then it's a lot less personal when you get to the point of having to have conversations and potentially going from informal to formal. Then the second part of this is the informal part, which is what you talked about, which is that to understand if it's head, heart, or hands, it's going to require some level of, you know, dialogue and conversation. It's going to require asking questions. It may require you observing and, you know, watching yourself. Like, there's a lot of work as a leader that you have to do to understand which one of those three things it is, and then what's your part in those three things potentially in making sure that you can help and support them to change the behavior? Because if you're going into a formal accountability conversation, but you don't know it's one of those three things, you don't know what's causing it, then shame on you, right? You should know that, and you should have taken steps to help them. If it is a knowledge thing and you've asked, and they're like, oh, I didn't know. Like, I wasn't sure. Okay. And you say, well, like, you've gone through that training. Yes, I went through the training. Okay, maybe it was a while ago. Maybe I don't remember parts of it. Okay, look, let's go through it again. Let's review it. Let's make sure that you understand it. Let's make sure that we both understand that this mistake can't happen again once you've gone through this training a second time. And if it does, what's the result of that? And you kind of have this upfront agreement to understand that, like, I'm willing to help invest some time or some effort or some resources into getting you up to speed, but like, this can't happen again as a result of this investment. You know, like, you have to spend the time in that dialogue, in that conversation, to really clarify what is causing this behavior to not be up to expectations or accurate. And I think in that dialogue is where you build that trust and that relationship and that ability to, again, help people get better at what they're doing, provide them with the opportunity to change their behavior and get better. And then if they so choose not to take that training or to continue the behavior even after you've done that work, now you can go into a formal space where it is less personal because you provided them with what they need to be successful.
Yeah, that's spot on right there. I remember consulting for an organization many years ago where I was asked to actually end somebody's employment. I was asked to terminate their employment. And I'd been consulting for this organization for, maybe a month. And I had only met this person one time. And I was basically acting as the HR leader for the organization. And in the absence of the HR leader, there wasn't one. That person left the organization. They didn't have one. I said I would come in and do that work for them, but it would be on a temporary basis. I wasn't a full-time employee. And one of the things that happened was I was asked to terminate somebody's employment. And the conversation went really well because in my mind I was thinking, I don't have the right to terminate this person from a relationship standpoint, only from a transactional standpoint, and that doesn't feel very good. So we sat down and I was talking with them about why, I kind of looked over the performance and why they were being terminated. And I asked them why they were here to begin with, like why they wanted to be here and why is it that their performance was what it was. And the conversation basically went along the lines of that they thought the job was going to be this and ended up being something else. They thought they were going to have more of their own personal stamp on the work they were doing, that they were going to have more creative input on what was happening, and they ended up feeling like they were a tool for somebody else's work that just kind of had to like check off some boxes and do this list, and it was just a very uninspiring work to them. And that's why their performance had dropped off when it came to this. And we talked about why they remained here, even though that was the case. And it was purely a matter of comfort and fear. It was the job, it pays well, and I don't, know where else I would go instead. I don't know what else I would do instead. And, the conversation ended with them leaving the organization, but with a very different feeling from them versus what it would have been if it was sign here, get out. And a person who's being held accountable, if you value the relationship at all, then that relationship needs to be valued by you from a standpoint of how you would hold somebody accountable who you wanted to still have a relationship with. If you're coming into a conversation about accountability and you don't care about the relationship, it will show. The only conversation that has to happen with is the one that actually terminates their employment. If it's done, if the relationship is done and you have approval and all the T's are dotted and I's are crossed and everything's in a row and everything's perfect and it's an actual termination of employment, then at that point in time, if you don't really want to worry about focusing on the relationship, then that's on you. Although it does feel better if you can terminate somebody with dignity, if you can let them leave a little bit of grace, if you can talk about how maybe this wasn't just the right fit for them and that there's going to be other things out there. I think as human beings, we should kind of saddle that sense of responsibility, at least in some sense. But if it's not that conversation, which the vast, vast majority of conversations where holding somebody accountable lie is not in the termination conversations, but is in the process up to that, the relationship needs to be important, and it needs to be separate from the accountability. And when leaders muddy the waters, when they sandwich the accountability with the relationship back and forth, you leave an employee feeling like they don't know who they're talking to right now. Are they talking to their leader holding them accountable, or are they talking to their leader who is helping them accomplish their goals and dreams? And even though you have to be the same person, you don't wear both of those hats at the same time. They are different hats, and they have to be separated in order to make sure that your employees know that you have two roles when it comes to them. One is to make sure that you pull out all the stops necessary to help them accomplish their goals and dreams, that you are there to provide the tools they need in order to make sure that they have what it takes to move forward with whatever that next step is, but that you also have a responsibility not just to yourself and to your organization, but to their coworkers, that they are held accountable to the same standard that their coworkers are held accountable to, because it will eat away at the morality of a team if people start to get the impression that some people are held accountable and some people are not. And you can articulate that to them. This isn't something you have to just kind of exude without saying. You can actually say this to people right up front. You have both of these responsibilities and you have to juggle both of them, and you want to be clear about why this conversation is happening, but that it's not going to change the way that you feel about them or that you're going to move forward with them. That is absolutely okay to articulate up front, because without telling that story to an employee, they're going to tell their own story, and it might not be the one that you want them to have in their head going forward after a conversation about accountability.
Yep, I completely agree. And with that, it brings us to this episode's 1-minute hack. But first, a few words from our sponsors.
The 1-minute hack.
All right, for this episode's 1-minute hack, here's what I want you to do. Get out your paper, and I want you to write down, divide the paper in half, and I want you to put on the top of each side yes and no. On the yes column, I want you to write down the list of the employees who report directly to you, who you would have a conversation with them about accountability on something very serious, something that wouldn't necessarily have them lose their job, but if they, let's say, were to do it a second time, they would lose their job. So something very serious. Write their name down in the yes column. If you would know how to have that conversation with them right now, and I'm not saying that it would be easy, but that you would move forward with that conversation in confidence, knowing that you could have no degradation of the relationship between you and them after that conversation. And on the no column, write down the list of the employees who that is not the case. People who you worry about a conversation like that with them because you worry about how well they will perform or how productive they will be or how the relationship will be between you and them after a conversation like that. If you find the majority of your people are on the yes column, then good for you. That's fantastic. Anybody who's on the no column is a potential problem, because those are the people who you will avoid conversations with about accountability on the little things because they are difficult to have and they will become big things over time. Those are the people who you have to focus on. Those are the quintessential squeaky wheels who need to have some effort put into when it comes to the relationship so that they become people in the yes column because inevitably you will have to have conversations with them about accountability. It could be something tiny, procedural, or it could be something big. And if you're having a hard time with those conversations with those people, then you're setting yourself up for failure. So get everybody over to that yes column by putting the work in terms of making sure that they know there's a divide between the relationship and the accountability, and that you can do both with them.
Yeah, I think it's a great 1 minute hack. And I can think of times in my career where there were people that were kind of the squeaky wheel, and they may have been difficult to communicate with or to sit down with or that type of thing. So it was much easier to just like let that space exist and to only interact with them when you had to. It became way more difficult when there was any type of formality to conversations in regards to accountability or things like that. And to your point, had there been more upfront interaction, had there been more intent to have dialogue about some of the little things and some of those types of things, then I think it would have gone one of two ways. It would have either gone to the point where the relationship could have improved and these things maybe would have not had led down the path of formality, or when it got to the point of formality, it was not the first time we were talking about this or having conversation. And so it wasn't kind of this element of a personal type of thing. It was more about the work that needs to get done. So I think it's a really good practice. It's going to require a good amount of heavy lifting, but it's also aligned with like when I tell people to, the time to start to do work or to engage people about like career progression is not necessarily when a job is open. It's in the in-between time. It's go talk to people about the next job that you're looking to work towards when there is no job open, and when you could ask them and you could do that type of work, so that when it opens, number one, there's no surprises. Everybody knows that you're interested. And number two, you've done some work leading up to it. It's similar to this. Like the time to try to build that relationship is not while you're at the table doing a formal accountability procedure. You have the conversations and the dialogue in the informal, in the in-between, so that when you get to that point, if you do get to that point, it's either an easier conversation to have, or it never gets to that point because the relationship's been built and the behavioral expectations have been set.
Yeah, and it serves nobody to kick the can down the road. I remember speaking about this during one of our very first episodes about an employee who wasn't really breaking any policies or rules, but they just kind of had a chip on their shoulder all the time, a negative attitude. And I was a fairly new leader that didn't have a lot of experience as a leader, and I kind of let it go because they performed well, and it was an uncomfortable conversation to have with them. And when it finally reached a tipping point where I had to have the conversation with them, their response was, wait a minute, I haven't changed at all over the last year that I've been reporting to you. Why is it all of a sudden a problem now? And they were right. Why was it a problem now when it wasn't a problem a year ago? It was a problem a year ago. I just didn't have the courage or the tools or the resource, whatever it was that I felt I needed to have that conversation. And by having that conversation on day two, you see something happen once, and you file it away, but you don't say anything because maybe they're having a bad day. You see it happen a second time, and that conversation has to happen. You can't just hope it goes away because you're trying to have a good relationship with them. That accountability piece is necessary, and the clarity is necessary. When you have that conversation, it's like think about the last time that if you're listening right now, if you had a spouse or a significant other yell at you for doing something and they had not said anything to you about it in the past when you've done it, because in their mind they were thinking, I'm going to let this go. And then all of a sudden it gets to them, it becomes too much, and you get yelled at for the collective 100 times you've done it in the past, but you've never heard it was a problem before. That can feel very unsettling. You can feel very attacked in those moments. And that's how your people will feel too. The conversation has to happen long before there's an emotional component to it, long before there's a serious problem. When it's a minor problem that they have plenty of opportunity to fix, and you will be more likely to have them fix it.
Absolutely. And with that, it brings us to the end of this episode. This is Hacking Leadership. I'm Lorenzo.
And I'm Chris.
And we'll talk to you all next time.